Back in episode 236, we talked with Amy Edmondson about her work with psychological safety. And as much as I buy into that, and I think the feedback I got from listeners that, hey, this makes sense, we buy into her research and what was done at Google and other places, in many ways, a lot of us were left hungry because it's like, it's a neat idea if you have that environment, and it's important for us to create that environment. But what do we do when we're not in that environment and we still feel like we need to speak up? Well, as it turns out, Jim Detert from the Darden School at University of Virginia is one of the clearest voices on how to speak up in situations like that. And we're talking to Jim today about his Harvard Business Review article entitled Cultivating Everyday Courage. So, Jim, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I don't know if this is true for you, Jim, but a lot of the people we interview when they're doing research, they go, if they're really transparent, they're like, it started with a little bit of me search. So I don't know how you started down this path, but I'd be interested in how you got started and how would you summarize your research journey over the years?
Yeah, so many people, right, talk about the issue of we perhaps study, that which we're not good at or that which we're most flummoxed by. I would say I've been asked this question a lot, and I don't have the great starting point answer to this question. Honestly, I stumbled into studying speaking up at work. As I've thought about over the years, why have I stayed so fascinated in this topic? What's become clear to me is that some of us struggle with the issue of speaking up itself. We find it difficult to, stick our neck out, to be disagreeable. That actually was never my challenge. And so in that regard, it's not really a me search project at all. But I think, Kim Scott recently wrote a book called Radical Candor, and she talks about people can, and put simply, right, radical candor is this notion of, telling the truth, being candid, but also doing so in a way that people really believe you care about them, that you have the best intentions. And she talks about people who miss the mark in being radically candid often do so from one of two angles. Either they suffer from ruinous empathy, which she describes as, the endless conflict aversion that leads us to think we're being helpful by not saying something, when in fact we're not. The classic case there would be, I don't want to embarrass you by telling you your fly's open, so instead I let you go out on stage in front of 1,000 people with your fly open. But she also talks about the problem of being obnoxiously aggressive. And there she says, yeah, you're a truth teller, but you do so in a way that people don't actually think you care about them. They think it's just destructive. And, as I've matured, what I've realized is that while I've never had a problem at all with speaking up, I've always been seen as very direct and candid. There were ways in which I went about speaking up that made it difficult for me to be effective. Sometimes because people probably didn't think I actually cared enough. And in other times because I wasn't sophisticated or savvy in the ways I communicated. And so I suffered a lot from the problem of perhaps being sort of factually right or having sort of done my homework, but still not getting my message across in ways. And so for me, that's really been, I think, the personal part of speaking up is the journey to be effective.
That's good. That's good. I don't know. It seems like it's coded into us. Maybe it starts in the living room with siblings or in the schoolyard with the kids, but or maybe in front of the dominating teachers, or I don't know, but it seems like it's coded into us, Jim, that if we speak up, we put ourselves at risk. And you certainly studied this extensively. So what are a couple of the top reasons that we don't speak up?
Well, the most obvious risk, if you ask people, in any workplace, why don't people speak up? The thing that wins in a landslide is it's not safe for me in a sort of career, professional, economic sense, right? If I do it, I might get blackballed, I might get lose my opportunities for promotion, or I might get fired. That's of course that's most directly related to notions of psychological safety. What I think we often quite underattend to is that there are at least two or three other main reasons people don't speak up at work. One is that people are really afraid of the social consequences of speaking up. So I might not get fired or blackballed, but I might get socially isolated. And if you think from an evolutionary standpoint, for most of humans' time on Earth, we existed in very small tribes or clans, and to be socially ostracized, right, to be sort of left out alone, literally meant certain death. So it's not really at all a stretch to say that we're probably hardwired to be just as afraid of social rejection or isolation as we are of other kinds of harm. And then, of course, there's, for some people, more than people who have roles like you and I are likely to think about, there are some people for whom speaking up actually can entail physical risk. Being courageous isn't just, for firefighters or police officers, but there are lots of service type employees and others who actually will talk about the physical harm they potentially put themselves in. And then the final category I've seen over and over is what I'd call psychological risk. So people don't want to feel stupid. People don't want to, put an idea out there only to learn that it reflects they don't have as much knowledge or insight or sophistication as somebody else. And so, actually, there's a myriad of reasons we don't speak up, and it's pretty tough to create an environment in which all of those factors are eliminated.
Right. Yeah. The benefits are there if you do, but to find it and to really foster it is difficult. Yeah. So you, in the article, you identify 4 principles that improve our chances, not guarantee. It's not the 4 steps to speaking up without getting fired. It's not that, but improve our chances of creating positive change. That's what we're really trying to do. If we act, create positive change. And just as a way to try to understand these, I'd love to propose a scenario and this is based on a real life situation. Let's say someone listening to us, they're responsible for leading some sort of project or program, and they've uncovered some discrepancies about how some information is being reported by some peer groups that are contributing to this program. Let's say our listener uncovers that some of these other groups, they're burying their cost overruns into other buckets. So the initiative really looks pretty good to senior management. They're signaling project is green, despite maybe some pretty significant over budget concerns. So our listener feels like, well, this is like an ethical issue. It's hiding the underlying problem. We're not going to fix it. But the thing is, these other people have more power in the organization than what they do. They're maybe peers, but maybe they've been there longer. They seem to have more clout. And so the person's like, man, what do I do about this? So your first principle is to lay the groundwork. So how would you summarize what lay the groundwork means, and how might it apply to this scenario?
Sure. So, this is a difficult scenario, among the most difficult, because in all the research I've done, if you look at an entire array of kinds of behaviors that people report requiring significant degrees of courage and therefore infrequently do, those involving ethical violations tend to be those rated the most difficult to do. There's a strong human need to see ourselves as good, decent people. And so when you're in the terrain of potentially labeling somebody's behavior as unethical, it's a tough road to get right. So when we talk about, laying the groundwork in that situation or any other situation, there's really 2 elements to that. One is, what can I do internally to actually increase the chances that this might go well if I choose to take it on? And that's really about what you do outside of that particular instance to create the perception in those involved that you're fair, that you're even-handed, that whilst you might be, for example, in this instance, speaking against the behavior they're doing, they've seen you stand up for and take their side on other issues. It means that you've been seen as sort of having, the emotional stability and sort of overall disposition that when you speak up, it's not out of anger or jealousy or spite, but it's because, you actually care about the issue at hand. For decades, psychologists have talked about this whole bucket of things as really having developed idiosyncrasy credits. It's this sort of stock of goodwill that allows you to sort of be non-conforming or speak against the grain on a given issue because you've gone with the grain or been sort of part of the team enough times that when you do it, you're allowed to sort of cash those chips in and still remain on the team. So that's one set of factors is, have you sort of earned the right to be heard on an issue like this? The second set of factors is really more about you personally. It's about, have you created the conditions where no matter how poorly it goes, you're going to be okay? And I think about that across two different sets of factors. One is, are you so valuable both within the organization and outside the organization that no matter what happens, either you will have to be retained or you won't care about being retained because you'll have plenty of opportunities. Right. And the second thing is, have you built your life in a way that you aren't completely crippled by, whatever we want to call it, golden handcuffs or inability to leave one's job. People often think that failure to speak up or be courageous is the domain of lower level workers or lower paid workers. And what I've seen is that people at the very tops of organizations are often just as afraid and just as unwilling. And when you ask them why, you realize that no matter how much greater income they have, they also have a lifestyle equally as lavish. And so most of us feel we can't risk our jobs without severe hardship. And so I really think about creating the conditions for speaking up as the set of things you do internally to maximize the likelihood of being heard, but also maximizing the internal security to know that you could absorb whatever blows might come, should it not go well.
Yeah, I love the practical aspect of that. So let's say our listeners looking for some perspective. Maybe they seek some advice from someone that they trust. There's a fair amount of transparency in that trusted relationship. And the colleague goes, yeah, I hear you. You know what? That's just the way it is around here. And in the real world scenario this is based on, that's pretty much what he was told. And so our listeners faced with this second principle now, which is to choose your battles. And in a place where there's not necessarily psychological safety, we have to choose our battles. So, what have you learned in your research about choosing the battles, and how might it apply to this situation to the degree that you understand the situation?
Yeah. I think also about choosing your battles as involving a couple different kinds of considerations. The first is, how important is it really to you? And that has really the dimension of, what are your key values and goals? What are the things that, if you allow to happen at work, are such a violation of your sense of integrity or authenticity that you literally can't sleep at night? Or conversely, what are your goals around sort of your legacy or the mark you want to leave, and how important is that specific issue? Again, if you think about the range of individual difference, some folks like me have a sort of hair trigger tendency to want to speak up about anything and everything we perceive as unjust or problematic. And others, seem to have this ability, to always tell themselves, I'm going to wait for a bigger issue or a different time. And I think this is really about saying, don't fall into the trap either of standing for everything and therefore standing for nothing, but also of fooling yourself, that you're going to do it later, and in fact, never doing much. And so I think in your particular example, the question is, how egregious is the particular ethical breach? How important are the objectives of the initiative itself? And if he or she were to prevail in sort of exposing this and actually stop it from happening, would the focus so shift to sort of changing the way things are reported or the trouble that those folks would be in, that it actually deters from whatever that important initiative was, that perhaps was a more important thing than the hiding? Because what your friend or colleague was essentially facing was a question about whether, in this particular instance, cleaning up the process for how people were reporting or pushing issues was more or less important than the actual initiatives being pushed. And right, that's, I don't know the answer to that. Right. But what I do know is that to put it metaphorically, I have seen many people win a battle on Monday that turns out was pretty unimportant by Friday. But on Friday, when they asked for more resources or more attention, we're told, we gave you all there was to give on Monday. The second part of that is really, though, about timing. I don't know that there's ever a better or worse time for addressing unethical behavior, but it's certainly the case in a lot of organizations. And the Me Too movement is a perfect example, where issues that at certain points in time are not getting any traction in organizations, are leading people to really feel blackballed or retaliated against, suddenly become much more forefront. And that can be around, really unethical, unacceptable behaviors and issues, but it can also just be around strategic ideas or initiatives that are not sort of attachable to key priorities in the moment, but 6 months from now might be sort of top shelf. And so there's a timing element too to deciding when to speak up about things.
I feel like historically, as maybe some wired up differently than you in this regard, maybe I'd be like, well, it's not that big of a deal, right? And so and then you end up getting what you tolerate, that bad behavior, or maybe catastrophize. That if I speak up here, I'm gonna get fired. If I get fired, I lose my health care. If I lose my health care, we'll also lose our home. If we lose our home, they'll take our kids. I won't. And so right, we run that sort of scenario, or I guess sometimes I think I mistake preferences for right or wrong. And so I'll fight a battle where the truth is, it's not a matter of ethics. It's just a matter of their preference versus my preference, right? So all of that can kind of go into this mix, can it?
Yeah, it sure can. A few thoughts. One, if you go back to this issue of us being hardwired for, survival reasons, to estimate risk and be really attentive to cues that signal danger. One of the things that, in fact, Amy Edmondson and I worked on a number of years ago is looking at what we called implicit theories. And these are sort of beliefs about how dangerous certain behaviors are, or what's likely to happen if you speak up at work. And I'm quite convinced that for pretty hardwired reasons, we are much more likely to overestimate or catastrophize, in your words, what's likely to happen than on average is actually likely to happen. And this makes a lot of sense, right? In survival terms, it's a lot more important to think you see a bear 10 times and run and be wrong all 10 times than it is to not be sure there's a bear and not run just one time. Right. So, I think we are hardwired to overestimate all sorts of risks. And we're not very good at testing. We're not very good at carefully putting our foot in the water to see if it's as dangerous as we think. Yeah. You also mentioned, I've done research in the area of moral disengagement, and a classic moral disengagement tactic is to say things like, it's not that big a deal. It's called distortion of consequences. Or to say in situations like this, everybody does it. That's called diffusion of responsibility. And, one of the things I think for those of us who have a tendency maybe to speak up less than we might ideally like, it's good for us to be on the lookout of these uses of language that suggest we're morally disengaging. Because as long as we can tell ourselves everybody does it, or it's no big deal, or no harm done, or, we choose to label it borrowing or creative accounting rather than theft. The parts of ourselves, right, our moral self-regulation system or our conscience that should lead us to say, I must stand up or speak out, get sort of tamped down by this sort of clever use of our of language in our brain. And so when I, in other contexts, when I work with organizations, I'll say it's good to become aware of the common forms of moral disengagement, and actually to create a system whereby when you hear those most commonly used phrases, to actually have that be a signal to stop for just a second and say, hey, I heard everybody does it. Is that really true? Or even if everybody does it, does that make it okay?
Right. Yeah, that's good. That's a whole area. That might be a separate conversation, because I can see it interdepartmental where we call it, well, they're a bunch of idiots, right? So we're labeling them as moral disengagement in a way, I would imagine.
Well, that's actually right. That's just a mild form of dehumanization, right? If you look in all forms of war, what do people do? They make up all sorts of horrible names, right, for the enemy.
Right.
And it makes it easier to harm without guilt.
Yeah.
And I think, in reality, in organizations, we also label, competitors or other departments as stupid or robotic or all sorts of other frames that make it easier to see their humanness.
Man, that is so good.
to not see their humanness.
That is so good. So in this case, some of that could come into play. Now, I keep going back between this is some fictional scenario and the actual scenario that I'm thinking. And so in this person, this listener, actually my friend, the way he kind of boiled it down is, the bottom line is my name is on this too. And so if I allow it to propagate, eventually I am kind of, involved with this. And so as best he could tell, and best our listener could tell, I need to act. All right. And maybe there's this big project review meeting coming up. So maybe timing wise, it might be the time to act. Some initial hinting maybe with the boss, and some others led that maybe there's some defensiveness, maybe tried to drop some hints, and people are kind of like, hey, So your third principle is to persuade in the moment. So what do you mean by that? And what are some things maybe this person might want to keep in mind?
Yeah. So, going back to what I was saying about, some people have the challenge of, motivating themselves to speak up, and others have the challenge of sort of doing it effectively. And for me, the latter being the case, this is really where that comes into play. So it's about realizing that at the core, this category is about realizing that when you're speaking up about something, by definition, the reason you're speaking to somebody else is that you don't have the power or control or resources you need to address the issue yourself. If you did, there wouldn't be any reason to speak out, right? And so while we know that implicitly, what we often forget when we then do speak out is that presenting your case in the language or logic that most appeals to you might be utterly irrelevant. You're already convinced that there's an issue, and you're already convinced that your solution's the right one. But that doesn't really matter, because you're not the target. You're not the decision maker. You're not the one who has to change. And so there are just a lot of different, specific or micro strategies people can use that at some level all boil down to making the case most appealing to the person you need to persuade. So for example, maybe for your friend, this issue was fundamentally a cultural or normative violation, right? This was wrong. But perhaps framing it as sort of morally or culturally wrong was only going to evoke defensiveness in people who then felt they were being called unethical. So perhaps a different way to frame it would have been in more instrumental or business terms. What were the economic consequences of operating a process for sort of getting attention or resources that involved having to hide real costs? It might be that whereas, when we sort of feel a moral violation, we tend to jump to sort of us versus them. I'm right, you're wrong. It's as you said a couple of minutes ago, sometimes these issues are more a matter of perspective about what's appropriate or right. And so using language that is what folks like Chris Hardress and others have called a partial view. It's helping people see, I have a perspective on this that suggests the following. But I understand that's just one perspective, and there are other ways of seeing it. Can you help me understand how you're seeing it? There can be a huge difference in reaction just from choosing to use the words, the simple switching of the word and the. So when you say the right thing to do, you're implying that you know the right way, and anybody who holds the alternative view is wrong. When you say a possible way to go on this is blah, 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 you're implying that you just have a partial view. You have one point of view, but other reasonable ones exist too. So there's so many ways in which we often frame things that suggest what that reflects what psychologists call naive realism. And Lee Ross talked about that. It's the idea that there actually is a single unknowable truth out there. And the corollary is that I'm the one who knows it. And it's obvious. And if you don't see it, it's because you're selfish or stupid. And not surprisingly, that evokes all sorts of defensiveness in others.
Seems like part of this is also, I took from your article about not taking the emotional bait.
Yeah.
This part too, right?
Yeah, and I think there's really, I think about the emotional aspect as really twofold. One is not allowing your own emotions to throw you off track. So not, for example, being so angry and indignantly right about the matter that you send off, whether it's verbally or in your body language cues that suggest you're angry and you're self-righteous. Or at the first sign of somebody raising their voice or acting defensive, you look so you look so afraid that you've sort of immediately assumed the one down position. So part of it is managing our own emotions, and the other thing is really learning to be very savvy about picking up cues that suggest somebody else is becoming angry or feeling pinned in a corner. And the sooner you can recognize that, the sooner you can sort of employ strategies. In some training we do here, one of our great trainers always talks about using yes and language rather than but language. And essentially, when a person becomes defensive, rather than feeling you have to sort of counteract their point by sort of explaining why it's wrong or inappropriate, just learning to say, yes, I completely understand that you might be feeling like this is an attack on your integrity. I'd probably feel that way too. And here's what I know we both care about. And, the latter is a strategy we talk about is win-win framing. All too often, right, when it's you have a point of view and you're speaking against somebody else's point of view, what gets lost is that you're actually you're all on the same team. Right? You all work for the same organization. And I think trying to help people see that your intent is not to win so that somebody else loses. Your intent is to help the organization come to the best choice. And so much of how we communicate and frankly, so much of how we teach people in courses like negotiations to debate is really win-loss framing. It's in order for me to come out ahead, you have to lose. And that can be pretty destructive when you're actually trying to convince people to go a different direction.
Yeah, man, that's well said. It'd be nice if all these worked out great, right? But some are going to turn out poorly. And so let's say our listeners' actions led to some difficult conversations, let's say, but ultimately, even though it's difficult, some important changes were made to kind of get the program back on track. So enough of it came out that we could make some decisions. And so it seems good. Yet in the meantime, some of the colleagues feel like they were outed, that they were exposed. And there's some lingering tension that maybe not stated, but you could feel it. And so you refer to the final principle as following up. So tell us about that and maybe how it could apply to this situation.
Yeah. So I think that often we spend so much, emotional energy. We invest so much in sort of, steeling ourselves to actually have that confrontation or that, that difficult conversation, that when it's over, the last thing we want to do is engage it anymore in any way. And what I'm really suggesting here is the people who I've studied who have been really skillful at this have a great instinct around that being the wrong conclusion. That even, I'll come back to your example in a second, but even when it appears to have gone really well, it's so often the case that the person who, said, yes, I agree with you, and yes, let's do that, actually doesn't care that much about it. And the next day is not going to actually, immediately set to work taking those next steps or allocating those resources. And so even in the best case scenario, following up is really about going and clarifying, what was your position and what next steps did we agree to and on what timeline? And it's about sharing credit and thanking those who have helped you. Now, in a case where you've ruffled some feathers, it's really about having, if you will, sort of the courage or the smarts or both to not avoid that additional difficult conversation, but to go and have it. Just this week, we were talking about some new initiatives in our programs, and overall, my sense is that it went very well. But there was one person who said a number of things throughout the meeting that led me to believe, this wasn't sitting quite right. And as much as after all the prep work we had done for that meeting, as much as I was tired after that meeting, I really wanted to just, sort of go back to my office and get on with it. I instead marched right up to that person's office a few minutes later and just poked my head in and said, hey, you seemed upset at a couple points in the meeting. I really like to understand that better. Can you help me? Can you share with me what that's about? And, we had just a 10-minute meeting in which it was clear to me that one or two things I had said just as supporting points for a broader a pitch hadn't sat right with him. And as soon as I clarified what I meant by those couple sub points, he was actually quite fine with the broader direction we were heading. And it proved to be really worthwhile to have just, made that extra effort to go have that 10 or 15 minute conversation. And I think particularly for those of us who don't really like difficult conversations and who find this whole thing, difficult and exhausting, it can be really hard to go yet again and try to have those conversations.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's so important. And I'd have to think, even as people listen to us, Jim, that they'd say, well, all right, I agree with what he says. I agree with the article, but I'm not Jim or I'm not as thick-skinned as him, or I'm not as naturally assertive. And so I like how you put in the article that this is not something that's at the DNA level necessarily, thank your parents or blame your parents, that these are things that people can learn. So convince us of that here, Jim.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say is, people saying I'm not Jim. I think, my wife would probably say, thank God for them. I don't really know anybody. I mean, anybody that I think any of us would want to be around who thinks this is easy. If you care, if you're socially perceptive, it hurts you to hurt others, and it hurts to not have things go well. So I think this is hard for all of us. More to your point, what I would say is this isn't about being Jim Detert or Gandhi or anybody else. We actually have no evidence that suggests this is easy for some of us and hard for others based on any really identifiable characteristics. Speaking up, showing courage, showing competent courage is, as far as I can tell, not a function of any obvious characteristic. It's not a function of men versus women, or tall people versus short people, or asserted extroverted people versus shyer people, or people with, stronger or certain types of religious beliefs. It's tough for most of us. And as far as I can tell, the people who do it well because they do it often enough and they practice enough that they simply have gotten better than most of us are. And so I like to think of it, courage as a muscle, much like any muscle we have. If you don't use it, it atrophies and it's not going to be available when you need it. I think courage is the same way. If you if you never speak up, if you never practice in the moments that aren't that terrifying, why would you think it'd be easy or doable in the crucial moments? And retired Colonel Eric Kale has a great quote about that. He essentially says something to the effect of, hoping or thinking you will be courageous in those crucial 30 seconds when you haven't been for the last 10 years is a cowardly approach. And so my answer there is, it's not about being anybody particular. It's about actually having the sort of discipline to practice. And what I recommend people do is think about, a courage ladder, or, a series of behaviors that, at the bottom, or feel the least risky. So maybe a conversation with a partner, even in a private sphere of your life that, you need to have, but you've been avoiding, up to the most, terrifying, behavior you can imagine. And then actually taking steps to start at the bottom, taking on that behavior that feels scary, but potentially doable. Because I think what happens is people, when you say, be more courageous, or, companies say, I want to encourage courage. I actually think what happens is most of our initial thought of what that behavior would be is actually sort of a top rung behavior. We think of sort of the scariest, biggest behavior.
Right.
And then one of two things happens. Either it's so scary that, of course, you don't do it, or because it's the biggest, hardest thing on the list, you do it, it goes poorly, and it just self-confirms, yeah, that's crazy and stupid. I'm never going to do that again. And so, pick manageable acts that feel within your reach, even if risky, and practice in reasonably safe domains.
I like that. What are some additional resources? You mentioned the Radical Candor book, whether it's a book or any other resources. What do you recommend if somebody wants to take the next step in this?
So I think there are books. My favorite book on this topic is a book called Difficult Conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's about 15 years old at this point, but it's truly a classic.
Yeah, we've interviewed Doug Stone before.
Yeah, so great work. Yeah. Crucial Conversations is another good book. Mm-hmm. I like the work of Brene Brown on Daring Greatly. She talks about the importance of vulnerability. And while her focus isn't on workplaces specifically, I think a lot of what she says makes sense. And then I think, anything on, related to understanding our emotional selves and how to, sort of keep ourselves calm, understand and read others' emotions can be useful. Mm-hmm. And personally, I love to read. Right now, I'm finishing Doris Kearns Goodwin's new book on leadership about both of the Roosevelts and Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson. And I find those inspire me, and they remind me that, these things I contemplate doing in my life, while they might feel big or scary to me, they're actually pretty small compared to the kinds of risks and the kinds of sacrifices others have made. And so sometimes actually just reading for inspiration helps.
That's good. And you've got an assessment, or you mentioned an assessment that kind of gives us some perspective about workplace courage, or everyday courage.
Yeah. So a doctoral student of mine, Evan Bruno, and I, over a period of 5-6 years, collected all sorts of data, essentially asking people the specific types of behavior at work that required significant amount of courage. And iteratively, we condensed that to 35 specific kinds of behaviors. So there are lots of behaviors that involve sort of speaking truth to power. There are behaviors involving confronting peers about various things, difficult issues with clients, and then all sorts of even difficult situations with subordinates. And we built what we call the Workplace Courage Acts Index, and that's a free tool available online. It's at Workplace CAI, so workplacecourageactsindex.com. And what you do is you simply, for each of those 35 behaviors, you indicate in your proximal work environment, how much courage would it take for that behavior to happen?
Mm-hmm.
And then what percentage of the time when those opportunities arise in your workplace does the behavior actually happen? And not surprisingly, those are pretty strongly inversely correlated. Right? The more courage any behavior scene has taken, the less frequently it tends to happen. And if you do that, it's a free online survey. And if you do that survey, when you finish, you immediately get a PDF, a printable report that shows your responses to the questions against the distribution of everybody else who's ever taken the survey. And, what I find is that people both, take some comfort and some disappointment in how much courage these behaviors are widely seen as taking. But I think people also feel, they're not isolated in their perceptions. And many people obviously end up being really curious about, what are the environments in which it either takes a lot less or a lot more courage to undertake these behaviors.
That's a good dose of perspective. And, for those listening, if you want to learn more about how to practice everyday courage, regardless where it is on the ladder there that Jim talked about, I highly recommend you check out Jim's article. It's in the November-December 2018 issue of the Harvard Business Review. And I put links to the article as well as that survey that Jim just mentioned in the show notes for this cast. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you.
So let me just say this. If somebody asked you, and I know it depends on the context, but if somebody goes, hey, so what do you do? How do you respond to that, Jim?
So, if I think it's a question where they don't really want the answer, I'll give them the technical answer, which is, I'm a professor of leadership and organizational behavior, and I'm also the associate dean for our executive degree programs and our leadership initiatives. If I think they actually might really be interested in what I do, then I would say what I'm interested in doing is creating a psychologically safe context in which they actually are willing to feel quite vulnerable. And what I mean by that is I really view my job, and it's an incredible privilege, as being somebody who can ask people to think about and learn about and talk about things that they don't feel particularly safe or comfortable doing in most other aspects of their work life or maybe even their overall life, to consider new ways of thinking about those issues, and then actually to be vulnerable enough to try to actually really put themselves sort of on the line, whether it be role playing or actual experiences they'll have with me. And what I'm convinced is true is that the vast majority of us don't really have in our work life safe spaces like that. And what educators should view as an incredible privilege is that we can help create these safe spaces where people can both think in a broader way and try things that they would never be willing to do in their work context. Because, as much as Carol Dweck and others have talked about organizations should, create learning orientations or learning environments, in reality, in work situations, most of us are in a performance mode. And we're afraid that if we actually open up to admit what we don't know how to do well, or what we're struggling to sort of think about in a different way, we actually risk getting in trouble. So the great privilege of higher education should be that it should be a safe place to do that.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Actually, I find it pretty inspiring because I feel like in some ways higher ed's gone the other way, that it's create places where you don't have to be exposed to some of the ideas or have good conversations. So good for you.
Yeah, I tell my students, I teach a class here called Defining Moments, and I tell my students, and I mean this in the most polite way, and absolutely, obviously, with no disrespect to people who have, been harmed in any way, physically or emotionally. But I tell my students, minute one of day one, that this is a sort of general trigger warning about any potential microaggressions. And in a sense, the point of the class is to trigger real feelings and difficult thoughts, because if we can't actually do that here and work through that here, then as we see in society today, where are we going to learn how to do it?
Right. Well said. All right. That's a wrap, man. You know what? I could talk to you all day on this one, Jim. I know you got lots of meetings, but thank you so much for your generous time here. I really appreciate it. It's so practical.
Yeah, it's when you work in leadership and ethics or in this domain specifically, one thing that's true for better or worse is you never, the world we're living in, I'm not going to run out of material.
Oh my goodness. No, that's for sure. That's for sure. Is this, I don't know, why is this not a book?
It's not a book because I'm too busy to finish writing the book. It is a book. It's just not a book yet.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I think,
it's totally.
It is one of those things where when I listen to your HBR interview, the IdeaCast interview, I'm like, why have I not heard of this guy yet? I mean, this is like so needed in this world right now. So anyway, I appreciate your time today, Jim. And
so you're in you're outside Chicago, right?
Yeah, northwest suburbs of Chicago.
What suburb you live in? I
live in Lake Zurich. So do you know the area?
I grew up in southern Wisconsin. So.
Oh yeah. I didn't detect any Packer colors or anything there. So
I didn't wear them today. Yeah. Kind of a bleak season. You want to rub it in? You want to talk about your Bears?
Oh, let's go.
Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah, we don't get this opportunity very often. But,
I was going to say, first time since about 1987 you've been able to talk snack?
Yeah, it's the first year we've had psychological safety to bring it up. So
Good luck. Good luck with that.
Yeah, I appreciate it.